We seek answers because silence is uncomfortable. We trace paths because we fear being lost. But what if the story of the Ninth Legion isn't meant to be solved? What if their greatest legacy is the void they left behind? Today, we follow the messages that never arrived and the names that faded into the Roman stone. We are not just looking for an army. We are looking at the face of the unknown. If you are listening to my stories right now, I wonder, where in the world are you joining me from? Perhaps in the quiet of the night or amidst the rush of the day. Wherever you are welcome here. But before we step further into the shadows of this enigma, if you are a soul drawn to the whispers of the past and the mysteries the world forgot, you have found your sanctuary. Join our growing circle of seekers by subscribing to Dreamy Old Stories. Together, let us journey into the depths of history where the truth remains hidden and every story carries a secret. Welcome back. This is Dreamy Old Stories, and today we uncover a tale that was never meant to be told. Across the distant routes that once connected outposts and cities, there are faint traces of passage that suggest movement without confirming its completion. Narrow roads stretch through uneven terrain, their surfaces worn but incomplete in places, as if the journey they supported was interrupted. Small markers stand at intervals, some leaning slightly, others partially obscured by the ground. There are no visible carriers, no figures moving along these paths, yet the structure of communication remains embedded in the land, quietly indicating that something once traveled here with purpose. The experience of imagining these routes carries a subtle awareness of distance, where the space between origin and destination feels extended beyond simple measurement. The air along these paths seems to hold a quiet tension, as if something once moved through it with intention. There is a faint sense of anticipation, not tied to any specific event, but present in the way the environment suggests continuation. The ground beneath each step feels connected to a larger journey, one that stretches beyond what can be seen, carrying a quiet sense of movement that no longer completes itself. A gradual shift begins to emerge as the idea of movement along these routes starts to loosen, no longer forming a clear connection between 2 points. The markers along the path appear less aligned, their spacing feeling less precise, as if the direction they once guided has softened. The road itself begins to blend into the surrounding terrain in certain areas, losing its clarity in small sections. The sense of a message traveling forward becomes less defined, replaced by the quiet suggestion that the journey has paused somewhere along its course. There is a quiet reflection that forms within this incomplete passage, where the absence of arrival becomes more present than the act of sending. The mind begins to consider how communication relies not only on intention, but on completion, and how something can remain suspended when that completion does not occur. The message, though unseen, seems to linger within the space between points, not lost, but held in a state that resists resolution. In this way, the silence of response becomes a quiet presence, shaping the meaning of what was never received. Along the routes where messages once passed from hand to hand, there are quiet signs of exchange that no longer continue. Small resting points appear at intervals, marked by slightly flattened ground or the faint remains of temporary shelter. These places suggest pauses within longer journeys, moments where movement slowed before continuing onward. The arrangement of these points follows a loose pattern, spaced in a way that once supported steady travel. Now they remain as isolated indications of connection, each one hinting at a larger network that once carried words across distance. The sensation of being within these spaces carries a quiet awareness of interruption, where the expectation of continuation feels present but unfulfilled. The air seems to hold a faint impression of motion that does not resolve, as if something once passed through but did not complete its path. There is a subtle tension in the atmosphere, not sharp or pressing, but gently sustained, suggesting that something remains unfinished. The body senses this through a quiet alertness, a feeling that movement might resume, though it never does. A gradual shift unfolds as the sense of exchange begins to fade into something less defined. The resting points no longer connect clearly to one another, their spacing losing its sense of purpose. The ground begins to recover its natural texture, softening the marks that once indicated repeated use. The idea of messages moving between these points becomes less immediate, dissolving into a quieter awareness that something has paused without clear reason. The structure of communication loosens, no longer forming a continuous path. There's a quiet realization that arises from this interruption, where the absence of arrival begins to shape the meaning of the journey itself. The message becomes less about what it carried and more about the space it failed to cross. The mind begins to notice how silence can take the place of response, not as an absence of meaning, but as something that carries its own quiet weight. In this way, the journey remains unfinished, held gently within the distance it was meant to travel. In certain stretches of these routes, faint objects begin to appear that suggest the presence of communication without revealing its content. A small fragment of parchment lies pressed into the soil, its surface worn and partially folded, edges softened by exposure. Nearby, a broken seal rests in two uneven pieces, its impression no longer complete, yet still hinting at authority once carried within it. These remnants are scattered lightly, not gathered in one place, but appearing at intervals, as if they were part of a journey that slowed and then quietly stopped before reaching its end. The experience of encountering these fragments carries a quiet sensitivity, where attention rests more carefully on small details. The texture of the parchment feels fragile, responding lightly to the slightest touch, while the seal carries a faint hardness, its surface marked by subtle indentations. The air around these objects feels slightly heavier, as if holding a quiet trace of what they once contained. There's a sense that these fragments are not meant to be fully understood, but simply noticed, their presence offering a quiet connection to something that remains incomplete. A gradual shift becomes visible as these objects continue to change under the influence of their surroundings. The parchment curls slightly at its edges, reacting to moisture in the air, while the seal pieces settle further into the ground, becoming less distinct over time. Small particles of soil gather across their surfaces, softening their outlines and blending them into the terrain. These changes unfold slowly, altering their appearance without removing their presence, allowing them to remain while becoming less defined. There is a quiet reflection that forms while observing these incomplete remnants, where the absence of their original message becomes more significant than the fragments themselves. The words that once filled the parchment are no longer visible, leaving only the suggestion that something was meant to be communicated. The mind begins to rest within this absence, recognizing that meaning can linger even when its form has faded. In this way, the fragments hold a quiet space between intention and arrival, where communication remains suspended without resolution. Across a narrow crossing where the ground dips and rises again, there are faint signs of interruption that suggest a journey paused at a specific point. The path narrows between two slightly elevated edges, forming a natural passage that once guided movement through it. The surface here appears more uneven, marked by shallow disruptions that do not follow a clear pattern. Small fragments of material rest along the edges, as if carried to this place and left behind without continuation. The crossing feels like a point where direction was once certain, yet something within its passage quietly shifted. The sensation of standing within this passage carries a subtle awareness of hesitation, where the space feels shaped by something that did not fully move through it. The air seems to hold a faint stillness that gathers more closely here, as if the movement that once passed has slowed into quiet presence. There is a gentle narrowing of attention, where the senses focus more closely on the immediate surroundings, noticing the slight variations in ground and the quiet pressure of the space itself. The body responds with a slower pace, as if adjusting to an unspoken pause within the path. A gradual change becomes noticeable as the features of this crossing begin to soften under time and environment. The edges that once guided movement become less defined, blending into the surrounding terrain. The surface evens out in places, reducing the sense of direction that the passage once held. Fragments that remain shift slightly, settling into positions that no longer suggest movement forward. The crossing transforms from a place of transition into one of quiet stillness, where the idea of passage becomes less clear. There is a quiet realization that forms within this space, where the interruption of movement becomes more meaningful than the journey itself. The path no longer leads clearly from one place to another, but holds a sense of something unfinished. The mind begins to recognize how communication can pause not only in distance, but in specific moments where continuation does not occur. In this way, the crossing becomes a quiet marker, not of arrival or departure, but of a message that remains suspended within its journey. Across a wider stretch between routes, the land reveals subtle gaps where connection once might have continued, but now feels incomplete. The ground carries faint indications of direction that begin and then fade without leading onward. Small markers appear in isolation, standing without corresponding points ahead or behind them. The spacing between these elements feels uneven, suggesting that something intended to connect them no longer does. The landscape holds these fragments of structure lightly, presenting them not as a continuous system, but as separated pieces that no longer form a complete path. The sensation within this space carries a quiet awareness of distance that feels expanded, as if the separation between points has grown beyond its original measure. The air feels more open here, yet it holds a subtle emptiness that is not defined by absence alone. There is a faint sense of waiting, not active or urgent, but gently present in the way the environment seems to pause between one point and another. The body senses this through a quiet stillness in movement, where steps feel less guided, more uncertain in their direction. A gradual shift unfolds as these gaps begin to blend more fully into the surrounding terrain, reducing their distinction from the rest of the landscape. The markers lose their alignment, becoming less connected in appearance, while the faint traces of direction soften into natural irregularities. What once suggested continuation now becomes part of a broader surface, where no clear path can be followed. The idea of communication stretching across this space becomes less defined, replaced by a quiet openness that no longer holds direction. There is a quiet reflection that arises within this widening separation, where the absence of connection becomes its own form of presence. The message is no longer imagined as traveling, but as something that remains suspended between points that no longer meet. The mind begins to understand how meaning can be shaped not only by what is delivered, but by what remains unfinished. In this way, the space between sender and receiver becomes a quiet place of pause, where communication lingers without ever reaching its end. At the farthest extent of these broken routes, the landscape opens into a space where no clear signs of direction remain. The ground stretches outward without markers, without traces that suggest movement from one place to another. Any indication of pathways has softened into the natural texture of the land, leaving only a faint sense that something once connected distant points. The surface appears gently uneven, shaped by time and weather rather than deliberate passage. Here, the structure of communication is no longer visible, only a quiet openness where routes have dissolved into the wider terrain. The experience of being within this open space carries a different quality of awareness, where the expectation of movement or arrival no longer forms. The air feels lighter not because it holds less, but because it no longer suggests direction. There is a softness in how sound travels, fading quickly without forming patterns that draw attention. The body senses a kind of release, as if the need to follow or anticipate has quietly lifted. Each step feels self-contained, no longer part of a larger journey, but simply a presence within the space. A gradual transition becomes clear as the idea of communication itself begins to recede from attention. The earlier impressions of messages traveling, pausing, or failing to arrive no longer surface. Instead, the land presents itself without reference to those movements, carrying only its own quiet continuity. The absence of routes, markers, and fragments allows the environment to return to a more neutral state, where no single purpose defines its form. The transformation is not abrupt, but a slow settling into something that no longer holds the imprint of communication. There is a quiet realization that forms in this final space, where the absence of messages is no longer felt as a loss, but as a natural part of the landscape. The silence that remains does not ask to be filled, nor does it suggest what was once intended. It stands as a gentle conclusion, where the journey of communication has dissolved into something broader and less defined. In this way, what never arrived becomes part of a wider stillness, one that holds no expectation, only a quiet presence that continues without resolution. Communication is a bridge, but here, the bridge ends in midair. The parchment is torn, the seals are broken, and as the trail disappears from the cold northern mud, we must travel back to the heart of the empire, to Rome, to see how a city of millions slowly forgot the 5,000 it sent into the mist. Within the city, the presence of the legion appears only in scattered references, held in records that are stored among many others. Scrolls rest on wooden shelves, their surfaces marked with careful lines of writing that vary in clarity. Some entries remain sharp and readable, while others have faded slightly, their ink softened by time. Names appear within these texts, arranged in lists or mentioned briefly within longer accounts. The structure of record keeping remains intact, yet the specific traces of the legion are dispersed, not gathered in one place, but spread across different layers of documentation. The experience of encountering these records carries a quiet attentiveness, where the act of reading unfolds slowly through the texture of the material. The surface of the scroll feels smooth in some areas and slightly rough in others, where wear has altered its consistency. The scent of aged parchment rises gently, blending with the still air of the room. Light falls unevenly across the text, illuminating certain lines while leaving others in softer shadow. The eyes move carefully from one word to the next, aware that each detail must be noticed without expectation of finding a complete account. A subtle shift begins to emerge as the references to the legion become less frequent within the records. Earlier entries may mention it more clearly, while later ones grow shorter or more indirect. The spacing between these mentions increases, creating gaps that are not filled with further detail. The progression is gradual, not marked by a clear ending, but by a quiet reduction in presence. The legion does not disappear from the records at once, but becomes less defined over time, its place within the written accounts slowly diminishing. There is a quiet reflection that forms while observing this gradual fading, where the idea of the legion begins to shift from something documented into something remembered. The records no longer provide a complete picture, leaving space where certainty once existed. The mind begins to understand how presence can soften through time, not by being removed, but by becoming less clearly held. In this way, the legion remains within the city, not as a visible force, but as a quiet trace within the written memory of those who once recorded its existence. Within the quieter rooms where records are kept, the arrangement of scrolls forms long, ordered rows that stretch along the walls, each one placed with care according to subject and time. Wooden shelves hold these bundles in layered stacks, some tied with thin cords, others left loosely rolled. Small tags hang from certain groups, marked with brief identifiers that guide retrieval. The structure of the archive remains deliberate, yet within this order, the references to the legion appear scattered, not gathered into a single collection, but dispersed among many other accounts that share the same space. The experience of moving through this archive carries a sense of quiet concentration, where attention narrows to the act of searching among many similar forms. The air feels slightly enclosed, holding the faint scent of parchment and wood that has settled over time. Fingers brush lightly against the edges of scrolls, feeling the difference between those more worn and those better preserved. There is a soft sound as materials shift, a gentle friction that accompanies each movement. The process unfolds slowly, guided by patience rather than certainty, as the presence of the legion is sought among many other recorded details. A gradual shift becomes noticeable as the search continues, where the effort required to find references begins to increase. Scrolls that once might have contained clear mentions now offer only indirect connections, brief notes that suggest rather than confirm. The spacing between these references widens, and the context surrounding them becomes less focused. The act of searching itself changes, moving from recognition to interpretation, where each fragment must be considered carefully to understand its relation to what is being sought. There is a quiet realization that emerges from this process, where the legion begins to feel less like a defined subject and more like a faint thread woven through broader records. Its presence is no longer held in a single place, but distributed across many, requiring effort to perceive as a whole. The mind begins to accept that memory within these records is not always complete or direct, but often partial and dispersed. In this way, the legion remains within the archive, not as a clear entry, but as a quiet presence that must be gathered through careful attention. Beyond the shelves in open courtyards and public spaces, traces of the legion appear in more subtle forms, not written, but shaped into the surfaces of the city itself. Inscriptions carved into stone columns include names that once held significance, though they are now surrounded by many others. Fragments of dedication plaques remain fixed into walls, their lettering partially worn, yet still legible in certain angles of light. These markings are not arranged to tell a single story, but exist among countless others, forming a quiet layer of memory embedded within the architecture of the city. The experience of encountering these inscriptions carries a different kind of awareness, where meaning is not gathered through reading alone, but through presence within the space. The texture of carved stone feels cool beneath the fingers, its grooves shallow but distinct. Light shifts across the surface, revealing certain letters more clearly, while others recede into shadow. The sounds of the city move around these structures, soft and distant, allowing the inscriptions to remain part of the environment rather than separate from it. Attention rests gently on these details without seeking to fully interpret them. A subtle change becomes noticeable as the clarity of these markings varies from one place to another. Some inscriptions remain sharp, their edges still defined, while others have softened, their lines less distinct. The difference suggests a gradual process of fading, where certain details remain visible while others blend into the surface. Over time, the arrangement of these marks becomes less about clear communication and more about partial visibility, where only fragments continue to stand out against the surrounding material. There is a quiet reflection that forms while observing these scattered inscriptions, where the memory of the legion appears less as a single narrative and more as a collection of traces. Each marking holds a piece of recognition, yet none provide a complete account on their own. The mind begins to understand how memory within a city can become distributed across many surfaces, existing not in one place, but in quiet fragments that require attention to be noticed. In this way, the Legion remains present, not through a unified record, but through the subtle persistence of its name within the stone. Within quieter administrative spaces, references to the Legion appear in brief mentions inside longer documents that address many other matters. Wax tablets carry lines of writing pressed into their surface, some still clear, others softened where the material has been reused. Names and numbers appear in short entries, surrounded by unrelated records that continue beyond them. These mentions are not highlighted or separated, but sit within the flow of routine documentation, their presence small and easily overlooked among the broader concerns recorded by those who maintain these accounts. The experience of reading these tablets carries a different kind of attention, where the eye must adjust to faint impressions rather than clear ink. The grooves of the writing catch light unevenly, revealing certain marks while leaving others more difficult to see. The surface feels slightly warm to the touch, softer than stone or parchment, holding the memory of pressure rather than pigment. The surrounding space is quiet, allowing the act of reading to feel contained, where each line is approached slowly, without expectation of finding a complete reference. A gradual shift becomes visible as these administrative records continue over time, where the mentions of the Legion grow shorter and less frequent. Earlier entries may provide clearer context, while later ones reduce to brief acknowledgments that no longer expand into detail. The placement of these references becomes more irregular, appearing without clear connection to one another. This change does not remove the Legion from the records, but alters how it is represented, moving from something described into something only briefly noted. There is a quiet realization that forms within these fading entries, where the presence of the Legion begins to feel more like an echo within ongoing records. The mind begins to recognize how attention shifts within documentation, where certain subjects gradually move from focus into background. The Legion is still there, but it no longer occupies the same space within the written record. In this way, Memory becomes something that persists without prominence, carried forward in smaller traces that remain part of the larger flow of recorded life. In quieter corners of the city, where public attention rarely gathers, the presence of the legion appears in small personal objects that have been kept over time. A worn piece of metal rests among other items, its surface marked by faint symbols that are no longer immediately clear. A fragment of cloth, preserved carefully, carries a color that has softened, its original brightness reduced to a muted tone. These objects are not displayed prominently, but held within private spaces, where their meaning is known without needing to be explained or recorded in formal ways. The experience of encountering these objects carries a more intimate awareness, where attention moves gently across their surfaces. The texture of the metal feels cool and slightly uneven, while the cloth responds softly to touch, its fibers weakened, but still intact. The air in these spaces feels closer, holding a quiet warmth that contrasts with the more open areas of the city. There is a sense of still presence within these items, not through movement, but through the way they continue to be held and noticed in small, quiet moments. A gradual change becomes visible as these personal objects continue to age, their details softening in ways that alter how they are perceived. Edges become less sharp, colors fade further, and markings lose some of their clarity. These changes do not remove their significance, but they shift how that significance is expressed. The objects remain, yet their connection to specific events or identities becomes less direct, moving from clear representation into quieter suggestion. There is a quiet reflection that forms within these private remnants, where memory begins to feel less tied to exact detail and more connected to a general sense of presence. The legion, once defined through structure and action, now appears in these softened forms, carried through objects that no longer fully explain themselves. The mind begins to understand how memory can persist in subtle ways, held within materials that continue to exist even as their original meaning becomes less defined. In this way, the legion remains within the city, not through clear record or public display, but through the quiet persistence of what has been kept. At the far edges of recollection, the presence of the legion appears only in brief spoken references that pass quietly between individuals, without being fixed in writing or preserved in objects. A name may be mentioned in passing, carried within a conversation that moves on without pause. The words are not repeated with precision, and their form varies slightly each time they are spoken. There is no single version that remains unchanged, only a loose outline that continues to shift as it moves from one voice to another, existing within speech rather than record. The experience of hearing these references carries a softer, less defined awareness, where the meaning of what is said feels secondary to the act of speaking itself. The sound of the words blends into the surrounding atmosphere, not held or examined, but allowed to pass naturally. There is a lightness in how these mentions are received, without the weight of documentation or preservation. The listener senses the presence of something remembered, yet not fully held, as if the words carry only a portion of what they once represented. A subtle change unfolds as these spoken fragments continue to circulate, where the details they contain begin to shift more noticeably. Certain elements are emphasized while others fade, creating variations that move further from any original form. The references become less precise, their connection to specific events or structures loosening over time. What remains is a general impression rather than a clear account, shaped by repetition that alters rather than preserves. There is a quiet realization that forms within this final stage of memory, where the legion exists not as a fixed entity, but as something that continues through gradual transformation. The mind begins to understand how memory, when carried only in speech, adapts to each moment in which it is recalled. The presence of the legion becomes lighter, less defined, yet still present in a subtle way. In this way, it remains within the city, not through certainty, but through the quiet continuation of something that is remembered without needing to be fully known. The ink has faded on the scrolls of Rome, and the names carved in stone have softened under the sun of the empire. But where the written record ends, a deeper silence begins. We must leave the dusty archives behind and return to the earth itself, to a land that carries no memory, no monuments, and no ghosts. A landscape that witnessed everything and tells absolutely nothing. The land stretches outward in quiet layers, where low hills rise gently and fall again without forming a clear pattern or boundary. Patches of forest gather in uneven clusters, their edges blending into open ground rather than marking a defined line. The surface carries no visible trace of passage, only the natural variation of soil, grass, and stone arranged through long, gradual processes. No path cuts clearly across the terrain, and no structure interrupts the continuity. The horizon appears distant yet soft, shaped by forms that do not guide the eye toward any single point of meaning. The experience of being within this landscape carries a sense of openness that is neither empty nor filled with expectation. The air moves lightly across the ground, carrying faint natural scents that rise and fade without drawing attention to themselves. Sound travels quietly here, blending into the wider space, so that no single source stands apart. The body senses the ground beneath its feet with a gentle awareness, noticing small changes in texture without needing to interpret them. Each sensation feels complete on its own, without suggesting anything beyond its immediate presence. A subtle shift becomes noticeable as attention moves across the terrain, where small variations begin to reveal themselves in ways that are not immediately obvious. Light changes slightly as clouds pass overhead, altering the tone of the land without transforming its shape. The wind moves through different areas with varying intensity, bending grass in some places while leaving others untouched. These changes unfold quietly, without forming a narrative or direction, allowing the landscape to present itself through continuous, gentle variation rather than defined movement. There is a quiet reflection that forms within this absence of clear indication, where the land does not offer confirmation of what has passed through it. The mind begins to understand how a place can hold presence without holding memory in a visible form. The terrain does not speak of events, nor does it suggest conclusions. Instead, it carries forward in its own quiet continuity. In this way, the absence of witnesses becomes part of a landscape itself, shaping an experience where meaning is not given, but left open to quiet observation. Across a broader expanse, the terrain unfolds in long, gentle transitions, where open ground gives way to clusters of trees without forming a clear edge. The forest does not begin at a single point, but emerges gradually, with scattered trunks appearing first, then gathering into denser formations. Between these areas, small clearings open unexpectedly, shaped by uneven growth rather than deliberate spacing. Stones lie partially visible across the surface, some embedded deeply, others resting loosely. The arrangement of these elements feels guided by time rather than intention, creating a landscape that offers no single path through it. The experience of moving within this shifting terrain carries a quiet uncertainty, where direction is sensed rather than clearly defined. The air changes subtly between open ground and wooded areas, becoming cooler beneath the trees and lighter in the clearings. Sounds are absorbed differently depending on the surroundings, softening among the trunks while spreading more openly across the grass. The body adjusts naturally to these variations, noticing them without needing to interpret them, allowing the senses to follow the environment rather than lead through it. A gradual change becomes visible as the terrain responds to passing conditions, where light filters through the trees in uneven patterns, creating areas of brightness that shift slowly across the ground. The open stretches reflect this light more evenly, while the forest breaks it into smaller fragments. The wind moves through these spaces differently, bending branches in one area while passing more quietly through another. These changes do not suggest a direction or outcome, but they create a gentle variation that unfolds across the landscape in a continuous, unmarked way. There is a quiet awareness that forms within this layered environment, where the absence of clear signs allows the land to be experienced without expectation. The mind begins to notice how each part of the terrain exists within its own quiet balance, without needing to point toward anything beyond itself. The forest, the open ground, and the scattered stones do not guide or explain, but simply offer their presence within a wider continuity. In this way, the land remains without witness, not through emptiness, but through its quiet refusal to define what is past. Across a gently sloping valley, the ground widens into a soft basin where the land gathers itself without forming a clear center. The surface carries a mixture of grass and exposed soil, shaped into shallow curves that guide the eye without directing it. Small streams move quietly through this space, their paths shifting slightly as they follow the natural contours. Trees stand at irregular intervals along the edges, their spacing uneven, as if they have grown without reference to one another. The valley does not present itself as a place of passage, but as a quiet convergence of forms. The experience within this basin carries a subtle sense of enclosure, though no visible boundary fully surrounds it. The air feels slightly more contained, holding a gentle coolness that lingers closer to the ground. Sounds gather here in a softer way, not echoing, but settling into the space with a muted presence. The body senses a different rhythm in movement, where each step feels more connected to the surface beneath, as if the land itself invites a slower pace without requiring it. A gradual shift begins to unfold as attention moves across the valley, where the small stream alters its course slightly, guided by the slow movement of water through the soil. The edges of the stream widen in certain areas, narrowing in others, creating a pattern that changes without forming a fixed shape. Grass bends along its path, responding to the moisture and the gentle current. These changes occur quietly, without drawing focus to themselves, allowing the landscape to evolve in small, continuous adjustments. There is a quiet reflection that arises within this space, where the land gathers elements together without offering explanation for their arrangement. The valley holds water, soil, and growth in a shared presence, yet it does not suggest why these elements meet here or what has passed through them. The mind begins to understand how a place can exist without carrying visible memory, where its form is shaped by ongoing processes rather than past events. In this way, the land remains without witness, offering no account, only a quiet convergence that continues without narrative. Along a higher ridge, the terrain narrows into a long stretch where the ground lifts gently and then extends outward with a quiet steadiness. The surface here is firmer, with thinner layers of grass that reveal more of the soil beneath. Stones appear more frequently, scattered without pattern, some resting on the surface, while others are partially embedded. The ridge does not guide movement in any clear direction, though its elevation offers a wider view of the surrounding land, where hills, trees, and open spaces blend into one continuous landscape without clear separation. The experience of standing along this ridge carries a sense of exposure, where the air feels more present against the body. Wind moves across the higher ground with a slightly stronger touch, brushing lightly but consistently. The scent of the land feels more diffuse here, spread thinly across the open space rather than gathered in one place. Sounds travel further, yet they remain soft, fading gradually as they move across the distance. The body senses this openness not as emptiness, but as a quiet extension of space that holds no particular focus. A subtle change becomes noticeable as the light shifts across the ridge, revealing small variations in the surface that were not immediately visible. Certain areas appear slightly brighter as the angle changes, while others deepen in tone. The wind moves unevenly, creating brief patterns in the grass that form and dissolve without repetition. These changes do not alter the overall form of the ridge, but they introduce a quiet variation that moves across it in a steady, unmarked way. There is a quiet reflection that forms within this elevated space, where the absence of clear direction becomes more noticeable. The ridge offers a view, but it does not provide interpretation or meaning. The land stretches outward without confirming what has passed through it, leaving only its present form to be observed. The mind begins to settle into this openness, recognizing how the landscape holds itself without needing to explain or record. In this way, the ridge becomes part of a wider silence, where presence continues without witness or conclusion. Beyond the ridge, the terrain lowers into a broad plain where the surface stretches outward with gentle irregularity. The ground here appears more even at first glance, yet closer attention reveals small undulations that shift gradually across the distance. Sparse clusters of grass grow in uneven patches, separated by wider areas of exposed soil. There are no visible paths or markers, only a continuous spread of land that carries subtle variations in texture and tone. The plain does not guide the eye toward any fixed point, allowing the horizon to remain open and softly defined. The experience of standing within this wide space carries a sense of quiet expansion, where the body becomes more aware of distance without needing to measure it. The air moves lightly, touching the skin with a steady softness that feels evenly distributed. The scent of the land is faint here, rising only occasionally before fading again. Sounds travel briefly across the open ground, then dissolve without forming patterns that hold attention. The senses settle into this openness, adjusting to an environment that offers presence without direction. A gradual shift unfolds as the plane responds to subtle changes in light and air, creating variations that move quietly across its surface. Shadows form and recede as clouds pass above, altering the appearance of the ground in soft transitions. Grass bends slightly in some areas while remaining upright in others, reflecting the uneven movement of the wind. These changes occur without forming a clear sequence, allowing the landscape to shift gently without suggesting movement toward any outcome. There's a quiet awareness that develops within this broad openness, where the absence of defined features becomes part of the experience itself. The land does not offer signs to interpret or paths to follow, but presents itself through its quiet continuity. The mind begins to understand how meaning can be shaped by what is not provided, where the lack of direction allows observation to remain open. In this way, The plain holds its presence without witness, offering a space where the land continues without needing to explain what has come before. At the farthest reach of this open terrain, the land begins to merge into a distant horizon where detail becomes softer and less defined. The ground rises and falls in long, gradual movements that do not form distinct shapes, but blend into one another with quiet continuity. Vegetation thins further, leaving wider stretches of exposed soil that carry faint variations in color. There are no markers to indicate distance or direction, only a gradual fading of detail as the eye moves outward. The landscape feels extended rather than contained, offering no clear boundary where it begins or ends. The experience within this distant space carries a lighter awareness, where the senses begin to settle into a quieter state. The air feels more open, less shaped by nearby features, allowing each breath to move freely without interruption. The scent of the land becomes faint, almost imperceptible, blending into the wider atmosphere. Sound travels gently but without focus, dissolving before it can form any lasting impression. The body senses a kind of release here, where the need to observe closely softens into a broader, more relaxed awareness. A gradual transition unfolds as attention moves further outward, where the details of the terrain become less distinct and more unified. The small variations that once defined the surface begin to blend together, forming a continuous field of subtle texture. Light spreads more evenly across the ground, reducing contrast and softening edges. The movement of air becomes less noticeable, not because it has stopped, but because it no longer interacts with defined features in the same way. The landscape shifts into a quieter form, where individual elements merge into a wider presence. There is a quiet realization that forms within this final extension of the land, where the absence of witness becomes complete. The terrain holds no sign of what is past, no indication of movement or event, only its own quiet continuation. The mind begins to rest within this openness, recognizing that not all places carry memory in visible ways. In this way, the land offers a space where presence is not shaped by what has occurred, but by what continues, unfolding without direction, without conclusion, and without the need to be understood. The land remains a witness that refuses to speak. No markers, no monuments, just the wind moving over the ridges. And in this absence, we find the true nature of the ninth. They have moved beyond history and into the realm of the eternal unknown, a mystery that doesn't need a resolution to be real. Across the wide span of history, there is no single point where the disappearance settles into clarity. The records that remain are scattered and incomplete, their edges softened by time and distance. No clear boundary marks where knowledge ends and uncertainty begins, only a gradual thinning of detail that fades into open space. The shape of the mystery cannot be traced in full, as it appears only in fragments, each one separated from the next. What is visible suggests presence, yet offers no final form, leaving the outline of the unknown loosely held. The experience of approaching this absence carries a quiet awareness that is different from encountering something defined. The mind does not settle on a clear image, but moves gently between partial impressions that never fully connect. There is a softness in how thought unfolds here, where each attempt to understand feels less like reaching and more like observing. The atmosphere of this uncertainty feels calm rather than unsettled, as if the lack of resolution has formed its own kind of quiet presence that does not press for explanation. A subtle shift occurs as time continues to pass, not altering the mystery itself, but changing how it is held within awareness. New details do not emerge to replace what is missing, and existing fragments do not rearrange into clearer meaning. Instead, the space around the unknown becomes more familiar, allowing it to remain without resistance. The edges of the mystery do not expand or contract, but settle into a steady position within the broader landscape of history, where it continues to be present without drawing focus. There is a quiet reflection that forms within this enduring uncertainty, where the absence of resolution begins to feel complete in its own way. The mind no longer seeks to close the gap, but allows it to remain open, recognizing that not all things move toward explanation. The unknown becomes less of a question and more of a quiet condition, something that rests within the passage of time without needing to change. In this way, the disappearance continues to be held, not as something waiting to be solved, but as something that quietly remains. Across the written traces that remain, the structure of the mystery appears not as a single account, but as a loose arrangement of references that never fully connect. Short entries appear in different places, separated by time and context, each offering only a small portion of something larger. Margins carry notes that seem to echo earlier records without expanding them. Lists include names that do not continue into later documents. The shape of the unknown is formed not by what is clearly stated, but by the spaces between these fragments, where continuity quietly breaks apart. The experience of reading through these scattered references carries a gentle sense of incompleteness that does not demand correction. The eye moves from one line to another, pausing briefly on each mention, aware that no single piece will provide a full account. The texture of the material, whether parchment or stone, adds a quiet weight to each fragment, as if holding something that cannot be fully expressed. The surrounding silence within the records allows these small details to stand on their own, without being drawn into a larger explanation. A gradual shift becomes noticeable as attention moves across these fragments, where the expectation of finding connection begins to soften. The effort to align one reference with another gives way to a quieter observation of each piece as it appears. The fragments no longer feel like parts of a missing whole, but as individual traces that remain separate. The unknown does not move closer to resolution, but settles into a pattern of partial presence, where each detail exists without forming a complete structure. There is a quiet realization that emerges from this process, where the persistence of the unknown becomes more significant than any attempt to define it. The mind begins to understand that some histories remain open not because they are incomplete, but because they are carried forward in fragments that do not seek to join. The mystery continues, not through expansion or clarification, but through its quiet endurance within the spaces that remain unfilled. Across the broader timeline, the unknown appears not as a moment fixed in one place, but as a quiet presence that moves alongside the passage of years without changing its position. Events continue to unfold around it, new records are added, and other histories become more detailed. Yet this absence remains untouched by those developments. It does not expand into surrounding accounts, nor does it recede from them. Instead, it holds a steady place within the flow of time, existing alongside what is known without becoming part of it. The experience of considering this persistence carries a different sense of time, where movement forward does not bring the expected clarity. The mind begins to notice how the unknown does not follow the same rhythm as other events, which often become clearer as more information gathers. Here, time passes gently without altering the space that remains unfilled. There is a quiet acceptance in this realization, where the absence of change does not create tension, but allows awareness to settle into a softer, more continuous understanding of how time can move without resolving everything it touches. A subtle shift unfolds as attention moves away from expecting progression, allowing the unknown to be seen as something that does not require development. The surrounding details continue to change, offering new context and perspective. Yet the core absence remains unaffected. This contrast becomes more noticeable, not as a conflict, but as a quiet distinction between what evolves and what simply continues. The unknown begins to feel less like something waiting to be completed, and more like something that has found its place within the broader landscape of history. There is a quiet reflection that forms within this understanding, where the persistence of the unknown begins to feel natural rather than unusual. The mind recognizes that not all parts of history move toward resolution, and that some remain as open spaces that accompany the passage of time. In this way, the disappearance is not defined by what is missing, but by how it continues to exist without change, held gently within the flow of events that move around it. Within the broader landscape of records and places, the unknown takes shape as a kind of quiet interval, a space that sits between clearer accounts without forming its own defined structure. It appears in pauses between entries, in places where one record ends and another begins without direct connection. There are moments where a sequence seems to continue, then gently breaks, leaving a gap that is neither large nor small, but simply present. This interval does not disrupt the surrounding material, yet it subtly alters how the whole is perceived, introducing a quiet openness within otherwise ordered lines. The experience of encountering this interval carries a softened awareness, where attention slows without needing to focus on a specific detail. The mind lingers briefly in these spaces, noticing how they feel different from the surrounding information. There is a lightness to them, not because they lack substance, but because they do not hold the same density of detail. The senses respond quietly, not searching for what is missing, but resting in the subtle shift that these intervals create within the flow of understanding. A gradual change unfolds as these intervals begin to feel less like interruptions and more like natural parts of the structure. The expectation of continuity eases, allowing the gaps to remain without being filled. The surrounding details adjust in perception, no longer leading directly from one point to another, but moving around these open spaces with quiet acceptance. The unknown becomes integrated into the overall experience, not by being explained, but by being allowed to remain as it is. There is a quiet realization that forms within this acceptance, where the unknown is no longer approached as something separate from the rest of history. Instead, it becomes part of the way history is experienced, where clarity and absence exist together without conflict. The mind begins to understand how these intervals shape perception, not by providing answers, but by offering space. In this way, the unknown continues, not as a problem to be solved, but as a quiet presence that gives shape to what is known around it. Across later reflections and quiet retellings, the unknown begins to appear in the way it is approached rather than in what is described. It is present in the pauses between statements, in the careful wording that avoids certainty, and in the spaces where explanation could be placed, but is not. The structure of these accounts feels slightly altered, as if shaped by an awareness that something cannot be fully expressed. The unknown is not directly outlined, yet it influences the form of what surrounds it, shaping the edges of how history is spoken and recorded. The experience of engaging with these later reflections carries a softer kind of attention, where the focus is not on gathering facts, but on sensing how the absence is held within the narrative. There is a quiet shift in tone, a gentleness in how statements are formed, as if each word is placed with care to avoid closing what remains open. The mind becomes aware of this subtle restraint, recognizing how the unknown influences not only what is said, but how it is said, creating a quieter and more measured way of understanding. A gradual change becomes visible as this approach continues over time, where the unknown is no longer treated as something separate from the narrative, but as a natural part of its structure. Accounts begin to accommodate its presence without needing to address it directly. The space it occupies becomes more familiar, integrated into the way history is presented rather than standing apart from it. This shift does not bring clarity, but it alters the relationship between what is known and what remains open. There is a quiet realization that forms within this integration, where the unknown begins to feel less like an absence and more like a subtle influence that shapes understanding. The mind accepts that not all parts of history need to be fully defined, and that some remain as quiet spaces within the larger whole. In this way, the persistence of the unknown is not marked by resolution, but by its continued presence within the way history is observed and remembered. At the furthest edge of consideration, the unknown no longer appears as something to approach or examine, but as a quiet condition that rests alongside everything else. It is not marked by location or confined to a single record, but felt as a subtle presence that accompanies the broader landscape of history. There are no boundaries that contain it, no clear moments where it begins or ends. It exists within the spaces between events, within the intervals that do not call attention to themselves, shaping the overall texture of what is remembered without taking on a distinct form. The experience of recognizing this presence carries a calm awareness, where the need to define or resolve gently fades. The mind no longer moves toward explanation, but settles into a quieter observation of how the unknown coexists with what is understood. There is a softness in this recognition, a sense that the absence of clarity does not create imbalance, but allows for a more open form of attention. The surrounding details remain intact, yet they are no longer expected to connect fully, creating a broader sense of continuity that includes what cannot be explained. A subtle transition unfolds as this understanding deepens, where the unknown becomes less noticeable as a separate element and more integrated into the overall experience. It no longer stands apart as a question or gap, but becomes part of the quiet structure that supports the rest of history. The distinction between what is known and what is not begins to soften, allowing both to exist within the same gentle flow. This shift does not remove the unknown, but alters how it is perceived, making it less defined and more naturally present. There is a final reflection that settles within this quiet integration, where the unknown is no longer something to be held at a distance or brought closer for examination. It rests within the passage of time, neither changing nor demanding attention, simply continuing as part of the broader whole. The mind accepts this presence without resistance, recognizing that some parts of history remain open not by accident, but as part of how they endure. In this way, the disappearance is carried forward, not toward resolution, but within a calm and lasting sense of quiet persistence. The Ninth Legion did not just vanish. They became part of the landscape. They live in the gaps between the records, in the silence between the spoken words of the old city, and in the gray mists of the northern hills. Some stories end with a victory. Others end with a defeat. But the story of the Ninth Legion, it never truly ends. It persists, a quiet, enduring presence that reminds us that even in an age of total knowledge, there are places where the sun never breaks the fog. The ninth is still out there, walking, silent, unknown, and perhaps that is exactly how they were meant to remain.